Okay, so this is, so we just saw Scott's system.web.MVC demonstration. He kept saying a number of times that he's doing it on a prototype build, right? There's a prototype build, which is basically a zip file that's bouncing back and forth between Scott and a bunch of other people, myself included. And I mailed him 3 megs yesterday, and he mailed me 3 megs today. So it's all very highly source controlled kind of a thing. And it's just a prototype. We're screwing around. So this is a screwing around prototype. He's already said before that we're committed to doing both static and dynamic language support. But in the milestone that's currently being worked on, they're still getting into the dynamic stuff. So this is what I did Tuesday, Wednesday of this week on the prototype, because Scott's like, hey, we're going to this thing. Let's show something dynamic. We're coming to alt.net. Why don't we show some Python and some Ruby? We worked with Phil Hack. You guys know Phil Hack. He's coming to work as a PM on this team. So I'll show you something that I did on Tuesday, Wednesday, and then something that Phil did. And the internals and the kind of this is an interesting problem I ran into stuff is just for interest's sake. It's just interesting, but it's not anything that you guys need to sweat, and it doesn't necessarily reflect in any way the complete rewrite of the production stuff. Because this is Scott hacking on a plane. Scott's, Scott S parentheses, hacking on planes without snakes. And so here is, we've seen the system.web.MVC, we've got Hello World. We've seen the Hello World stuff before. So for example, taking a look at the routing, this was older routing. So I'm actually like 4 or 5 prototypes behind what Scott showed you. So bear with me. So like we had regexes for our URLs being passed into the route. You saw that was problematic, so we got rid of that. But the point I want to make here is what a route in this context is, in this prototype, right? A route is a mapping between that URL and a controller type, because we're talking about mapping URLs to object activation. Ultimately, some object needs to be created because of some URL, right? I'm getting there. That's why this is the interesting part of the talk, and why the 5 of you have stayed when everyone else has gone to lunch with Scott. But I'm not bitter. So this was system.type, okay? And we would go and create these controller types. So there was a activator create instance call in the handler where somebody would say, go and make me one of these, and they would take that type and they turn it into an iController. That seems like kind of common sense type stuff, right? And you saw that you could pass in factories, you could do all sorts of stuff. Okay, so I wanted to make a Python controller. So I'm using, the build that I'm using here is the release candidate or some internal build. I've only been at Microsoft 3 weeks, so I don't know what I'm talking about. So if I screw something up, chalk it up to my vast experience inside of the company. This is like a build from September, end of September. So it's newer than Beta 2, okay? But I went and I got the July futures release of IronPython. Okay, so this is a really old IronPython build. Specifically, remember that the July futures release had some DLR goodness in there, right? So it was the beginning of IronPython moving over onto the DLR. So I took an old DLR from July, a prototype build that Scott zipped and emailed to me, and I'm running it on a release candidate of Visual Studio 2008. So if that's not hacked up enough for you, then I don't know what else. All right, so this is an IronPython project, okay? So I've got a global.py here, and you notice that we've got little py icons, we've got little py extensions, and I've got syntax highlighting and whatnot inside of the development. This is all stuff you can play with now, right? IronPython is a supported thing that you can continue to start using. The DLR is not just people screwing around and releasing it on the web. It might be released on the web, but it's a fully supported thing when it comes out. The DLR is real. And I want to point out that it's not just about VB and C# anymore, right? There's going to be this whole language ecosystem, and the dynamic languages are as important as anything else. So this IronPython is something that you could be writing code in now. Now, you remember how the lines in the C# stuff were all in one line? I did that. I didn't know how to do that in Python, this route here. I was able to go and do it like this. So in Python, I ended up doing it on multiple lines because I don't know what I'm doing. And this is equivalent to that. Well, it would be if I went like that, but you get the idea. Now, controller type took a system.type. That's a CLR type. Okay, so as an ignorant individual to the CLR, the first thing I wanted to do was go CLR, CLR.get CLR type. And then I realized that in the dynamic world, in the DLR world, that doesn't work. You don't map a system.type to a dynamic type. These things are dynamic. So I actually refer to that object, this hello world controller PY, and I had to make controller type an object in this prototype because there's no shared subclass there that I can deal with. I could have made a parallel foo.dynamic controller type, but in this case I made an object and I shoved it in there. Okay, sue me. Well, don't sue me actually now because I work for the company. So in here in Python you say import CLR to get CLR stuff in there. You can do import sys like you do in classic kind of Python. And then when you want to get something out of a module like hello world controller.py, you say from this import just the classes that you want, or in this case get all of them. So I'm bringing in the route and the router in from system.web.mvc, and I've got everything from hello world controller. Hello world controller is over here, right? And remember, we've still got those same layouts as before, but not necessarily something that you have to stick with if you don't like it. So we look at hello world controller py. I brought in a number of things here, date, time, some stuff from here I'll talk about in a moment, and I've got a controller. We'll talk about the details in a second, but I wanted to go and make a list that would bring out that page of data just like Scott did earlier in the demo. Now in Python all your methods take self as a parameter. So we I think of that as a non-Python person as being like the no parameter parameter. But self is like the equivalent of this. Okay, so just take that for granted. There's a class level initializer there, constructor. I've got hello world with view, list, hello world. Now here I was screwing around. We'll talk more about list in a second. I needed to make hello world controller py that's getting passed into controller type something that would implement iController. So I figured I would derive it from controller, like we talked about earlier. So let's go look at what controller does in this particular prototype. The real magic's in controller base. So I start poking around here. I usually go and collapse the definitions and take a look. Remember how iController has execute. So execute takes that route data. Route data is the data transfer object for routes. And inside of route data are things like the action. So we've got the URL is like localhost /home/ hello world with view might be our action. So that's what this is. And it says invoke action. Okay? If we go into invoke action, then what do we start seeing? In the prototype we start seeing lots of reflection. So at this point we've already activated the controller. So we've created an object, it is an iController, and we're about to call it. So in the Python world, I haven't yet solved that. I haven't figured out how to make one of these yet in the narrative here. And then there's the invoke action, the act of actually finding the method and calling it. Here we're calling all sorts of reflection like get methods. But if I call reflection get methods on a Python type, I'm going to find that it doesn't have any of those things because it's dynamic. It doesn't have those until we call them. It's got the whole dynamic site thing. Okay? And then we run around looking for attributes like controller action. But we don't have attributes in Python, so we can't do those either. So you can see where it starts getting interesting. This is about lunchtime on Tuesday, and I'm starting to panic. But then I remembered that Scott had said everything's virtual that matters, right? So I went and made dynamic controller and derived it from controller and overrode invoke action. Here is this is again old build, so this context, this idea of this default context lives in the Iron Python runtime. That'll be in the DLR in a future release somewhere. And here I'm going to go and do the kind of the dynamic equivalent of reflection. This is the get bound member, and I'm going to go and get a hold of that particular action name. In this case, I want to see if there's a hello world on this particular object. So this hello world with view that I'm trying to call, we're going to grab that, put it in here. And then we're going to get a hold of a dynamic site. Remember, this is a little bit different experience than reflection. This is not something that you typically have to worry about. It's only interesting within the context of this talk because we're trying to bridge the CLR and the DLR. I would not think of this as being a typical experience for you as a dynamic language writer, right? The experience for you is going to be file new project and file new item, and then you'll just start writing stuff. So just as there were kind of interesting interop scenarios when you did COM to .NET, and there are interesting interop scenarios in the DLR to the CLR. But those scenarios are being worked out by the DLR team, and what you are looking at is what was going on in July. So there's going to be, I'm sure, many other ways to look at this. I'm just showing it to you because it's an interesting point of note. The point here, though, is that we're trying to turn that action into an actual invocation, and this is where that invocation occurs. And then the result in this case is whatever came out of that. Right now I'm not passing any parameters in, so in my demonstration here I didn't get the parameter passing stuff turned out. So I'm going to be able to show you list, but I haven't gone and converted the route data, path data, and parameters into something that I would pass in. What I would need to do would be parse those query string things, and then I would pass them in here as an array of objects. So just like in reflection when you've got a hold of your method info and you're going to start adding parameters, I would do the same thing in this dynamic world. So interestingly, while this is scary looking because you've never seen it before, compared to the CLR code, it's actually there's a lot less going on, because the dynamic runtime is just figuring those things out. And that's the kind of experience that, once you figure out some of the syntaxes in the DLR, it's all thought of, it's all handled for you. So just by making dynamic controller in this case, then I'm able to derive hello world controller PY from dynamic controller. So I can come in here and put a... So at this point, we'll step over that. And now we're off looking for the constructor of the dynamic object, because that's how we're going to make one of these. So we're going to go and we're going to invoke the constructor of that dynamic object. So let's step over this, and now I've got this controller. Let's take a look at what that looks like. This is where, for me, from a DLR enthusiast perspective, this is where it gets interesting. Because remember, this is inside of hello world controller PY, right? And what is its system.type? What is its underlying type? Well, it's generated. And that's why we can't go from a system.type to a DLR type, and why that initial mapping didn't work for me. But by simply sticking that object in there, without even knowing really what it was, from the dynamic world I simply stuck it over there, and now I can make one. So the factory concept can be abstracted away completely. And you could mix, as I will show you, static and dynamic languages within the same environment. And if your Vue guy enjoys Python, that's cool. And he's he's the artist, right? He's the one who knows CSS. Let him do Python. I'll show you more about that in just a second. So now, here's the cool part. Thought it would be cool to record. All right. So now, at this point, it's just an I controller, and we're going to call execute on it. So let's step into that. Here we're in C#, we're going to call invoke action. This is where I came into here, right? Now we're about to invoke that action. And now we're in the Python. We look at the call stack and see we've mixed the two. And you see how that hello world controller, the dynamic site, has a generated name as well? We don't sweat any of that stuff. It's just not our problem. It's just seamless. Trying to show you how well the DLR team has really tried to bake this stuff in. I mean, I've just done not just cross-language, because we've all done VB to C# debugging before, but now we're doing this DLR to CLR back and forth, and it's working very, very nicely. Now, two-page list was a really interesting thing. And again, I just want to point out that this was very July stuff, so this is not reflective of what's going on right now. But remember that Scott had that whole pagination thing. He didn't show it to you, but the deal is this. It derives from list of T. And it takes things like page size and page index, and it'll go and do a link query and say, skip this number, and then take a page size. That's how it's grabbing that. Skip 30, grab 10, and that would be page 4. Savvy? Now, the way that he makes it friendly is he puts a static method, a mix-in, right? An extension method. So everybody who is a page list of T gets this 2-page list. So I can go and say 2-page list, and I get my page list out, rather. Excuse me, anyone who's an iQueryable gets a 2-page list. Okay? So that's an extension method. If you've ever done C code, has anyone ever written C code and they felt like they really needed C++? So they wrote object-oriented C code by making a bunch of statics and then making the first parameter this parameter. That's kind of like one of the lies. You can do it in assembler too. It's just kind of one of those lies that we all did once we learned about OO and started associating methods that way. So that's the syntax in this instance. But you get this really friendly C# syntax, right? Well, in this particular build of Python, I don't have any of that, but they still let me get to it. So let's see how they did this. I call the static. Remember that the static was a generic, though. So there's my generic. I use it kind of as an indexer. The type product is an indexer. And then I pass in this. In this case, self.db.products is what I would have liked to have gone 2-page list on. But I wasn't able to, right? So I can still call that method here. And I put a little note there that I can't do extension methods, so I can pass that on to the team. And then I'll just go ahead and hit run. So then there is a Python controller and a Python view. So let's look at the view. You can see how the controller plugged in. Once you got the activation and the dispatch of the method right, we're cool. If you have questions, interrupt. Okay? I'm not trying to bore anybody. Now, if we go up here to the views, the code behind for this is really simple. But if you take a look at David Ebo's paper on trying to get IronPython to work in ASP.NET, you'll see that you couldn't just go and say load page or load control and have that ASPX page get loaded up. The relationship between the pages is different. So he had to create some interesting stuff for kind of Python web, where in my web config I have to put in my dynamic language modules, my script modules as HTTP modules to watch for these things. And I have to put in this magic here. Page parser filter type. He uses a thing called no compile pages because we're not compiling the Python, right? We're dynamically evaluating it. So it is the magic of that no compile page parser filter and this thing he created called the scriptable view page. So rather than deriving from system.web.page, we're deriving from this. Now, within the context of the MVC framework, at the point of this prototype, I didn't have that. I had only view page. But I needed it to look like a view page. So I had to plug in my own kind of thing, so I made a scriptable view page, deriving from David's work, and then just implementing iView. So I've built my own dynamic controller that does dispatch and activation into the Python world. I did my own script page. Now in this case I stuck it inside the prototype code, but I could have stuck it outside. I mean, nothing I've done here necessitated really the changing of the prototype other than the one routing thing. That one change from system.type to system.object, and I'll have to find a more elegant way to do that. So by deriving from script page then, we go into his web config and we say that it's cool for pages to have that base type. So then the list just derives from that scriptable view page instead of view page. I could have called it dynamic view page, I suppose, in retrospect, now that I'm telling you about it. And then it's just a regular old ASPX page, and it uses the language IronPython. Now, this is me not knowing Python very well, but if you know Python cares deeply about white space, just to make that point extra clear, you see how though that indentation matters and these spaces matter, there's that implied curly brace for the C# in us. That same thing happens here. So I had to be really careful about how I did my indentation of these things, because that indentation matters. So rather than futzing with that, laziness and being on a plane, I just did this. I'm not in any way trying to imply that that would be the way that you would do it in Python. I'm just trying to say that I got tired of futzing with the white space, so I punted. Okay? So don't feel bad. I don't. But we're using a Pythonism to spin through that data and spit it back out. So it looks a lot like what he did before. But this might be something that a designer feels good about. Okay? So in this case, I didn't make my own view engine though. Right? Ultimately, we're still using an ASPX page. And we're still counting on stuff like this. So I have not written my own view engine. I've extended this concept of views a little bit to make Python work. And if we take a look at view page, web form view engine.
What enables you to say language equals IronPython?
Installing the IronPython stuff and setting up this page parser filter type. And if you take a look, just go up and search for, go to ASP.net, www.asp.net/IronPython, and there's a great white paper that explains like step by step why that's important. Because we're used to these pages getting compiled and put on disk and the whole relationship between the page and the derived code behind and partial classes and all that kind of stuff. And that doesn't exist in this world, so he did it differently. And this is what makes that happen. Okay? Now, before, in the web form view engine, all it has to do is take a name of a view. Remember how he was saying render view? This is deeper in there. Load view list. And then an iView pops out. It's very, very simple. Remember how he said he wanted these interfaces to be as basic as possible. You make a view engine, you know, it's very simple stuff. Here's some more members that you would implement. Before, we were saying build manager. This is a system.web thing. You can use Reflector if you want to see that. Get compiled type, and then he would pass in, you know, foo.aspx and get back a type. Okay? And then he would make sure that that type implemented iView. If you ever wanted to use reflection kind of stuff to say, is this an iView? If you have a type and you want to see, is it a iView? This is how you do that with an interface, is assignable from. So he's making sure that that is in fact an iView. And then he's calling activator.createInstance. But remember before, when we were talking about activating URLs from system.types, now we can't do that. I can't take a system.type and get a dynamic instance. That's not going to work. But it turns out that because he plugged his stuff into that ASP.NET lifecycle, I could use createInstance from virtual path, tell it that I'll take anything that's an IHTTP handler, which is a little cheesy, and get back an iView, because in this particular instance, my list.aspx is an iView. Everything works because he plugged into that lifecycle. So we've made an IronPython view that plugs into the ASP.NET world. Didn't have to do it that way, though. That's just one way to have done it. But that makes sense? We did not write our own view engine, though. We'll do that in a second when we show you Ruby. So at this point, I've got a C# model down here talking to a Python controller and a Python view. That make sense so far? Okay. So that's going to offer people a lot of flexibility. I think that the idea that a designer might come in from a Python shop and want to immediately do work and is comfortable with this MVC kind of a world, or if you maybe are a .NET shop and you're doing MVC and you bring a Ruby guy in and he's the designer and he wants to write that, I think that's cool.
Probably going to be more compelling with the JavaScript, right? The JScript.
Sure. Yeah. If people want to write JavaScript for their pages, so they're going to have server-side and client-side JavaScript mixed in the same page. Sure. I think that it's going to take, there's going to be some interesting idioms as we try to prevent these views from becoming classic ASP again. But I think that the difference is that in classic ASP, our model and our controller and our view was all one page. So don't look at this and start to go, oh, here we go again, classic ASP. We've separated things so much that that's just not going to be possible. You only have the view data to mess with that you're past. So you give them as much rope as you want to give them. Does that make sense? Okay. So Phil Hack, better coder than I, Phil Hack, wanted to do Ruby, and he goes hacking around too. So keep in mind that Phil hasn't started work at Microsoft yet, and I've been there 3 weeks, so I haven't even got source control access yet. So I'm getting my source control is a zip file from Scott, and Phil's is also a zip file from Scott. So we're both hacking on stuff that's 4 months old.
How long do you have to be at Microsoft for the source control?
I just haven't asked yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, as long as I can go without it, the better.
1 year.
No. It's pure laziness at this point. Okay, so what he did was a little bit more interesting, because here he took the standard Hello World CS example, the one that Scott showed you earlier, right? And you notice how he's got this. Notice how we've got a list.aspx and a list.rhtml. So within a controller, he might go and say load view list, okay? But what view engine are we going to use? We've seen the web form view engine and what that does. It simply picks up an ASPX page, and like Scott was saying, it does everything but the postback, right? It's a very simplified life cycle, but you can use controls and do all the kind of goodness that you like about ASPX. And this is, for me, like, this is really interesting, because this is where it starts getting into like, oh dude, what could I make? So help me out and tell me if you get excited as well.
So this is effectively coupling from the controller into the view here, right? If you're coupling to saying, I want to render this view through. You can't.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that a coupling. I would say that the view engine, in this case, we put the name of the language in the view engine,
Yeah, so
but
if
I could call it really cool, smart view engine. I don't think I've coupled the view to the controller.
And you can always do that with Vue IOC. Yeah, so
I mean, that could be an IOC. The point that's, I hear what you're saying, but I don't think that's significant. If you do, we should talk about it. Okay, so he's written his own view engine entirely. So if I did like that, I would get the standard default view engine, the web form view engine. So he goes like this. Okay. So that's, oh, what's going on there? So what did he do? He made this. Actually, he probably made the unit, knowing Phil, he made the unit tests first. But here's the Ruby view engine. And this is going to get more and more evil as we dig into Phil's code, because it's very interesting. Because at this point, he has eschewed web forms, right? He's made a declaration. I kind of stepped a little bit, and I was like, I still like web forms, so I'm trying to make the Python stuff play in the web forms where I did not write my own view engine. So here he says, I'll take the name of a view, and I'm going to go and say .rhtml. And in his case, an RHTML file is just text. Let's go ahead and look at it just real quick. Notice that there's nothing up here that says @ there's nothing ASP.NET-ish about this page. It's just a text file. Okay. So then he goes and he says, make a new Ruby view page.
So this would be the process for,
Writing your own view engine.
yeah, and then typing the controller name to the view name that Scott was talking about, ScottHaOnDLR was talking about. Last definition, right? Where instead of having to call a render view, you can, that's the way you can.
Well, the point that Scott was making was that you can change the view engine on the fly. You can have the view engine be part of an IOC.
Yeah, I was talking about where you don't have to call render view, right?
This is not about that. That would have been a change in the controller. Scott Belware doesn't want us to have to call render view
Yeah.
down here.
Yeah.
You know, like kind of the go do it, and that would be something that could be done as a filter. Like you could do something like this.
Yeah.
Right? And then go like that. Or whatever. Or you could change the controller or do whatever you want. I mean, that's the thing that's so cool about this, is if you don't like it, you know, don't do it.
Is it called load view as opposed to render view? Is this an older build? Before it was render
The build that Phil has is even older than the build I have.
Okay.
Because because I work for the company. Yeah, and Phil does not.
Load view and render view are equivalent. They're the same.
Yeah. This is an even older prototype in a different Visual Studio instance.
Okay, so the thing he was doing with the
Okay, so let's go back. Let's just start again. So here's Phil's render view, and he has to return an iView. So he makes a Ruby view page. So this is a text file. So he opens a text file. This is a hack, let's just be clear, but it's pretty darn clever view. So here's where render view comes in, because there's load view and there's render view. The rendering would be, this is kind of complicated, but he feels it's on a little bit older thing, but the concept of a rendering of a view is still there. But let's get to this. So he uses the Ruby hosting stuff, and he's hosting kind of Ruby in his application here. And then he created a Ruby template. That's his RHTML, and here's where it gets special. here's Phil regexing script blocks. And for each match in the script block that he finds, he parses it as a Ruby script block, and he adds them all together, right, with a builder, and it'll get executed. Then he adds some references, and then executes the whole chunk. Good for him. You know, that's pretty cool. I couldn't have figured this out.
So once Iron Ruby is more mature, it gets replaced by ERB. Yes.
By what?
ERD.
What is that?
That's the new template.
That's the template language.
Our HTML is going to be replaced by ERD.
Okay, so this is an interesting point. This isn't about Rails on Windows. This is about the Ruby language in the context of this particular thing. And Phil just called that RHTML and did it that way because he wanted.
Right, I understand. ERB is not a Rails thing. ERB is a Ruby thing, and it does what Phil did. Probably not
Angle bracket.
Ruby today, which is probably why you did this.
Yeah, so the Iron Ruby guys will try to support, will support anything that's in pure Ruby. That's the goal, right? If there's some Ruby gem or Ruby library that has some C interop, then they're on their own.